Name, age, phone number, house number, job. Name, age, phone number, house number, job. Alan repeated the facts like a mantra in his head, clinging with unsteady focus to what little remained of him. He limped down the cracked pavement, thin as the soles of his shoes, with a mop of greasy black hair, a worn-out tweed jacket hanging over his skeletal chest. He'd made a slight detour on the way home from work, no longer able to ignore the growling in his stomach. He'd been putting it off for a long time now, unable to face the risk of another purchase. But as he'd sat there in his withered excuse of a bookshop, staring at the usual lack of customers, he'd suddenly found himself passed out on the floor. He had fainted from hunger, and there was no one there to call for help, if they'd have even bothered. He knew that was probably a sign to get a more lucrative profession, but the shop was one of the few pieces of him that remained. He'd sit there, in the dark and the quiet, and read all the titles that crammed the little shelves. Perhaps he'd read them all, once. Maybe he'd even written a few under pseudonyms. Every word he could still read was a tantalising glimpse of the life he could have had. The job was going to kill him one day. He wasn't stupid. But he knew damn well he was never going to leave. He crossed the final bend and looked around for his destination. There was a new stall, so he'd been told, just under the concrete bridge where the last remaining trains screeched along its ancient path. It was a pathetic little thing. A shabby construct of plywood and cheap white paint sat at the bottom of a ditch where junk and old rainwater collected. But it had food and drink, and that was enough for him. The old man at the till lifted his eyes, black pupils floating in a pool of pale yellow. Alan silently scanned the menu for the cheapest possible items. 137. The old man nodded and produced a lukewarm bacon sandwich and a cup of weak faux coffee. 2 memory tokens. And now came the moment. Alan dug through his grime-laced pocket and produced the stamp-sized slips of paper, dark green and marked with the letter M in block capitals. His fingers almost refused to give them up, clinging on with the last of his strength until finally the stall owner snatched them away. He searched his mind once more. Name, age, phone number, house number. Something else. He blinked. Another piece of him gone, like a star snuffed out in the night sky. Nothing to do now. He crammed the sandwich into his throat, suffocating his gut into silence, and downed the faux coffee in a single gulp. Salt and milk lingered on his tongue as he climbed his way back onto the path home, knee groaning in protest for a reason he could no longer recall. By the time he returned home, the last remaining street lamps had flickered into life, their orange glow infecting the corners of his street, bringing out the dirt like bruises under pale skin. The waste collectors were just finishing their nightly round, their jet-black vans screeching to a halt outside his neighbour's house. The doors swung open, and 2 orderlies emerged in their usual black overalls. They marched unthinking towards the large metal waste bin and threw open the lid. There came the usual burbling nonsense of a waster, nervous spits and cries for help. The orderlies reached inside and wrenched the helpless body of an old woman from within, her husband watching tearily from the window. Then, with a string of staccato gestures, they stamped her forehead with the waster symbol and dragged her into the back of the van, her writhing form quickly becoming indistinguishable from all the others. Alan watched in dark fascination. He'd known that the neighbours were falling on hard times, but he'd never have guessed they would be the next to go. He wondered what might have happened to them, why it was the wife that was going and not the husband, and whether she'd wanted it to be like that or if the choice had been made for her. It would hardly be the first time a relative had decided to pool all the household's tokens into just one pocket. Seemed the most sensible choice when you really thought about it. Better one whole person than 2 halves. He blinked, smacked with shame, and marched to his front door. It never paid to be outside when the wasters were being disposed of, not unless you liked the smell of burning flesh. She was waiting in the armchair by the disused heater, knitting a new undershirt with the last of the wool, her grey eyes looking ever more vacant by the day. He decided she was probably his wife, given the nature of the photos on the walls and the fact they shared the same bed, but for all he knew she could have appeared in his life just the other week. "Hello, Alan." "Hello." Did you have a good day, Alan?" It was like she was taunting him. Or maybe fishing for a simple mention of her name. Or maybe it wasn't even that. Maybe she was asking because she'd forgotten herself. He thought about asking her, but quickly decided against it. Better to stay silent than to out himself. "My day was good. How was work?" He strained his mind, finding nothing. Her face fell. "Dinner's in the oven." "Oh, I'm not hungry." He sat in the opposite chair, looking down at the floor. A long silence settled into the room. Perhaps he'd had hobbies once. It sounded like a reasonable assumption, but the evidence was nowhere to be seen. He closed his eyes tight in frustration. Always guessing everything. Always looking for proof of something that should have been obvious. People were vanishing faster and faster these days. There were barely half a dozen of them left in the street now. Not one who could remember how many had been there in the first place. He entertained the idea that it had once been one person to a house, or maybe even more. But the thought made his head spin. So many doors with so many people behind them. It felt impossible. Not without a good deal of uncollected wasters. Was this his hobby? Guessing the waste toll? If it was, he wasn't getting much amusement out of it. He took another look at the woman across from him. "They took the neighbour's wife tonight." "Who?" "The old woman next door. They took her away." "Oh." The silence returned. She knew. He stood from the chair and glanced at the pictures on the walls, each one packed with clues he could no longer decipher, moments snatched away. There was a wife-shaped hole just a few feet away, all the same features but without any context. He'd figured he could just fall in love with her again, build something from the faces in the frames and learn what he must have seen in her so long ago, but the grip of the amnesia was tight. She was an impenetrable mystery, a fragmented jumble of words and pictures that meant nothing at all anymore. The anger boiled in his stomach. His whole life stolen by the landlord, the shopkeepers, the taxmen, whittling him away piece by piece until he was nothing but a tiny list of facts. Name, age, phone number, house number. Name, age, phone number, house number. Name, age, phone number, house... A knock at the door broke his train of thought. It was a man. Bald, pasty, standing tall with a smile as broad as his accent and a pot of genuine coffee. Alan's eyes widened in shock. There was something about that face that seemed familiar, but the details fogged up whenever he tried to focus on it. "Oh, hi, just thought I'd drop by while I was in the area." A few seconds of silence. The smile diminished. You knew me from the bar down the street, James?" Alan nodded. "Yes, I think... How are you?" The man called James nudged his way through, Alan smelling the coffee as he passed. "Not too bad, my good man, not too bad at all." He waved at the woman in the armchair and she waved back. She seemed to recognise him. Did she have more tokens than him? And where did James get real coffee from? He hadn't experienced the smell of coffee beans in what felt like centuries. "I'll put the kettle on," she said. "No, I'll do it," Alan snapped. "Don't worry about it." James and Alan sloped into the kitchen, Alan making a gesture of trying to light the ancient gas stove, while James fiddled uneasily with the lid of the tin. "So," he said, "how are things between you and—" "Fine. Just fine." "Oh. Well, good." The tin popped open, the smell now overpowering. Somehow it seemed to mingle with the fog in his head, like the coffee was the true smell of his forgotten past. He had to know. Everything within him screamed for it, and every little utterance from his so-called friend that didn't answer the question was like a knife across his ears. "You know, the old bar closed the other week. Shame, really. Alcohol's a much safer way to... So how did you get the coffee?" He stopped dead, suddenly sheepish. Well, I bought it, didn't I? That's what you do when... I mean, how did you get the tokens?" Why do you want to know? Just curious." Well, I came into it, that's all. It's not that much. Half it just went into paying the last bar tab. Turned out I racked up quite a bill because I kept forgetting to... Half of what? No one just comes into wealth like that. Alan prodded him a little, sweat dripping from the man's potato-like head. Look at you. You're basically complete. What is it, new job? Alan, I don't think I can... Please, he hissed. I'm down to baseline here. I forgot my job today. I don't even recognise my own wife's face. If I don't do something quick, then... Alan shrank away, feeling the vertigo in his mind teetering over the edge. Just one more loss, one moment of forgetfulness, one amateur pickpocket, and that would be it. He could already feel the churning chaos threatening to overtake him. To be a waster. To be laying in your own filth for days on end, shut in a cold metal box with no idea who or what you are, how you got there or how to get out. Nothing but rolling fragments of broken memories as the final seams of sanity unravelled in your head. No. It wouldn't be him. Never him. He shot forward again, gripping the little man by his lapels. Tell me! James looked down, closed his eyes, and told him everything. It was a broken-down factory in the centre of town, a soot-smothered cathedral with a few flickers of candlelight emerging from within its darkened windows. He approached slowly, checking over his shoulder every other step, just to be certain he wasn't followed. The great doors swung open and his nose was assaulted with the smell of smoke and stale sweat. The place was packed with people, tense, silent, bewildered, the whole room charged with electric fear. They sat on old crates, long dead machinery serving as tables and bars where cheap booze was served in chipped ceramic mugs. Alan picked his way through and hovered around the largest of the tables, reading the rules of poker as the current game wrapped up. Seemed simple enough. Perhaps he'd played it before in his old life. He smiled. Another clue. A whiff of optimism. Suddenly the future didn't seem so... The shrill scream of an old man shot through him like a bullet. He spun and saw one of the final players writhing and babbling on the floor. Waster! Across from him, a stunned young woman collected a modest pile of new tokens, life returning to her eyes in an instant. His mouth dried, chest burning with anxiety. The heavily built bouncers carried off the new waster and flung him into the nearest dumpster. His fellow players watching for a moment before silently returning to the game. Last chance, he thought. Still time to leave. But his legs carried him to the now vacant seat. Who was he kidding? The choice had been made a long time ago. The game went on for hours. He'd told his wife he'd be a bit late back from work, but this was stretching the term a bit to its absolute breaking point. Had she noticed? Did she even care? Of course she did. Probably. Anyway, wasn't like he was going to stop now. He'd played cautiously, never making rash decisions, staying within his limit, and had slowly scraped up a small pile. He watched as a fresh wave of tokens came his way, his fingers caressing the paper, each one a piece of hope so nearly his. One by one the players dropped away, too scared to lose any more. They were being tested, like a crucible removing impurities from metal. The cowards were getting whittled away, the stupid and the undeserving scarpering like terrified children. Alan was more than that. He was the man who held on to a life based on nothing but a glance of a few old photographs. The one who could stick it out. The one who would persist where normal men would fold. Yes, this was him. It was like the tokens were already in his pocket. So at last the game boiled down to its end. 5 players became 4, 4 became 3, until at last Alan looked up from the mountain of paper and locked eyes with his final opponent. Such a frail-looking thing. A young man, skinny and weak, with thin yellow hair and eyes so shrunken that it was like they didn't even belong to him. In the stillness of the now empty factory, they watched one another as the dealer shuffled cards. "What are you after?" the young man asked. "Wife," Alan said. "You?" "Son." Alan looked down. Shit. He's only 3. I love him so much, but I just can't remember his name. He kept his eyes locked onto the table. It could be a trick. Easily. People lie all the time. He's asleep right now. Neighbours said they'd look after him. I just need to remember him. It's killing me. Do you have a child? No. The kid would be fine, he reasoned. If the worst comes to the worst, the neighbours could look after it. That's if it even existed at all. People are dubious, after all. Maybe this was how the guy would win these things. He could see that. Good psychological tactic to get the stubborn opponents to fold. It's like there's a crater in my chest. I can't stand it anymore. Your wife, you'd understand. The man reached out and tugged at Alan's sleeve. What I mean is, sir, if you want to fold now, I'd be happy to split the tokens half and half. Yes. There it was. The bait followed swiftly by the hook. That's not how the game works. The man's eyes widened. Please, sir, it's getting late and I want to be back home and you could fold. I'm already 10 tokens down. If I leave now, then... Sorry. The man closed his eyes and settled into his seat. How much to start? Alan laid down a single token. Best to start small. The man laid down one of his. Alan followed with another token. The man returned the gesture. Then came another token. Then another. Then another. The pile slowly building. What's your name? Asked the man. Raised to 5, said Alan, and threw a handful of tokens onto the table like confetti. I'm Andrew, he said. My wife was called... Are you going to fold or what? A pause. The man threw on 6. They didn't speak for the rest of the game. 6 became 10, 10 became 20, then 30, then 40. They were hurtling towards the end, neither willing to let go, too deep in to surrender now. Alan began to sweat with terror. What if he'd gone too far? A bet too heavy on a hand too weak. He checked again. 2 pair. That was good, wasn't it? Had to be better than the other man's. He reached with slickened palms to his side, ready to raise another 40, only to stare in horror at the empty space that greeted him. Both players all in, declared the dealer. Everyone show your hands. The 2 opponents locked eyes, their expressions perfectly mirrored. He thought one of them might speak, might finally surrender or offer some kind of condolence, but it was far too late by then. He took a deep breath, turning his gaze back towards the cards. 2 pair. It's pathetic! Just a few seconds to compose himself, that's all he had. Just a few more seconds of life before the end of everything he knew and everything he didn't. His heart began to spasm, vision blurring and shrinking. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was already happening. Sir, show your hand, said the dealer, a note of impatience in his voice. Okay, this was it. This was it. Oh God. Oh God. He closed his eyes tight, raised his hand, and slammed the cards on the table. Name, age, phone number, house number. It was still there. He looked up. Andrew, the opponent. His hand was totally worthless. Alan sat back in shock as the mountain of tokens was slid his way. Please, Andrew cried. Please, my son, he's only 3! But his pleas quickly dissolved into gibberish. With a final cry, he toppled off the chair and into the arms of the bouncers. The man was disposed of in a matter of seconds. Well, congratulations, said the dealer, before shoveling the tokens into a burlap sack for him. Try not to spend it all at once. A few seconds later, he was back out in the open air. Rain quickly filling the potholes beneath his feet, 1,000 little mirrors looking straight up at him. He said nothing. Felt nothing. Just paced in little circles, probing his mind for anything new. The bookshop didn't have any special meaning, it turned out. Okay, fine. He could throw it in tomorrow if he wanted. Get something more lucrative. He remembered why his knee had hurt the other day, a slight rheumatism made worse by the cold weather. Fine. But the pictures, what of them? He focused his mind, tried to see the photographs. The one nearest the door, him and his wife on the shores of some beach. Yes! It was a holiday, decades ago now, the first one they'd had together as a married couple. And the one above the dining table, the one with her raising a glass to the camera, that was their 5th anniversary. And the one with the wonky frame, their last holiday. And the one on the mantelpiece, a family reunion, taken just after he'd heard about her and... He stopped. The first holiday. He'd look at it sometimes and wonder where he went wrong. The 5th anniversary. Same bar he met James. Was she seeing him back then? Their final holiday. He was never that happy again. The reunion. The anger behind the smile, the guilt and the pain and the all-consuming rage. The fights, her pleading sobs, the strings of apologies, the feel of his hand colliding with her face. He heaved, leaning against the filthy brickwork for support. It was all coming back. The weight in his chest, the bile in his throat. God, the anger! It was desperate to the point of pain, the hopeless propelling of his fist into the wall again and again and again. Only the distant clang of metal broke his trance. There, in the overflowing bin of wasters, was the thing that used to be called Andrew, vacant eyes twisting in his sad little head. His kid was an orphan now, waiting at his neighbour's house for Daddy to come home again. Perhaps if he handed a few tokens to the body, then he'd somehow come back, jump from the waster pile and run off home with a quick "Thank you" and "I forgive you." But that wasn't how the game worked, was it? With quiet resignation, Alan slammed the lid shut and began his trek home, the prize weighing him down with every step he took.